Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our virtual author program with acclaimed Wall Street Journal reporter Josh Mitchell. My name is Allison, and I am an emerging technologies librarian at the Hudson Library in our Adult Services Department. And I'm pleased to moderate the discussion tonight with Josh Mitchell. He's written the newly released book, The Debt Trap: How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe, and certainly a timely read as our student loan debt has reached its all-time high at $1.6 trillion. Josh is a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, writing about the economy and higher education. In 2016, the Education Writers Association named him the nation's top education beat reporter among large publications, calling his reporting unique, comprehensive, illuminating, and a must-read for policymakers, prospective, and current college students and their parents. So we're excited to hear about your new book that was recently released on August 3rd. Speaking of his book, we'll put this in the chat. If anybody is interested in purchasing a copy of The Debt Trap, copies are available courtesy of our local bookstore in town, the Learned Owl. The link will be in the chat if you would like to purchase that, his new title. Also, I just want to mention during the program, we welcome your questions. We'll try to get questions at the end of the presentation. But in the meantime, you are welcome to go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can after the program. So thank you. Thank you all of our patrons for joining us tonight and supporting our virtual programs. We hope that you'll continue to join us for all of our virtual programming. We have an exciting lineup of authors and all different types of programming. You can visit our website at hudsonlibrary.org to see everything that we have to offer this coming fall. And of course, you can register for our virtual programming on there as well. So thank you for joining us. And Josh, thank you for your time tonight. This is really a timely discussion, since many prospective students are kind of embarking on a new school year. So
yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I know this book is a culmination of many years of your reporting and researching and interviews. Can you kind of talk about how you got started on this project?
Right. So, I started covering the economy for the journal in 2012. And as economics reporters, we always look for trends. Those are the best ways we can identify story ideas to figure out what we should be writing about. And one of the biggest trends over the past 40 years has been the cost of college going up. If you look at a chart of the cost of college starting in around the 1980s, that's really when the era of skyrocketing tuition really started, and it hasn't stopped. And so in 2012, there was a report that this agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau came out with, basically saying student debt had crossed $1 trillion. As you mentioned, it's now $1.6 trillion. Back then, it crossed $1 trillion. And so I wrote a story about that, just basically a straight up daily news story, not a big investigation. And it got a lot of clicks. A lot of people clicked on that story and read it. And I basically said, there's probably something more to be written here about this. And I did a follow-up story, and that got a lot of attention. And the more I wrote about this, the more interesting the topic became, and the more feedback I got. I would get tons of emails from people, emails from students saying, "Thank you for writing about this. I'm in, tens of thousands of dollars in student debt myself. I thought this was an investment, but instead, a lot of things have gone wrong, and I just can't get ahead of it, and I can't repay it." And my school lied to me about my job prospects. And now the government is garnishing my wages. And how did this happen? And all this interest is accruing. I would also get emails from taxpayers, people who were just Joe taxpayer who didn't have student debt themselves, but really felt frustrated by this idea that, the government is more and more getting involved in this system that is a really inefficient system. It's a lot like healthcare. even if you just observe it, you might not necessarily be directly affected by it, but as a taxpayer, you just see a lot of money going toward a service that is clearly very inefficient and has a lot of dysfunction to it. And so I get a lot of angry emails from people saying, thank you for writing about this. There's just something really screwed up going on here. And I feel like, our government is not really paying attention to a lot of these problems. And in some cases, maybe because it might be causing them. So this has really been just a great topic that has, given me hundreds of stories to write about. And it's one of the most emotional, it's probably the most emotional topic I've ever written about ever since I got into the news business. People are just so emotional about having student debt. There's a lot of shame involved in it. There's a lot of frustration involved. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of disappointment. And there's also a lot of people's hopes involved. I mean, there's probably no more a noble pursuit than pursuing an education and trying to improve your knowledge and your skills and, trying to improve your ability to make a living and get a better job and get a secure job and live the middle class American lifestyle. This has become intertwined with the American dream. And yet this noble pursuit for a lot of people has turned into a nightmare. And in a lot of ways, it's getting worse. And so that's why I embarked on this project.
Yeah, in your book, you had mentioned a 2017 Wall Street Journal poll asking whether or not going to college was worth the cost. And just under half of the respondents said yes. So half those who have attended or at least took the poll didn't feel that, as you were saying, they got what they had, they got out of it what they had put into it or hoped to put into it or hoped to get out of it. So you talked a little bit about like how are student loans affecting, is there a certain age demographic that it's most affecting, or is it kind of widespread among undergraduate, graduate?
No, I'm glad you asked that because that was one of the points I wanted to make. And first of all, I think it's really important to know that was a really eye-opening poll. And one of the reasons why it's eye-opening is because only 4 years earlier, a majority of Americans, a solid majority of Americans said college was worth it. So college has become one of these institutions that a lot of people have lost their faith in. And I think a lot of it is because so many people have gotten into student debt in such a short amount of time. And this is a really important point. It's not just people in their early 20s. It's not just 18-year-olds. Half of people who owe student debt are over age 35. A fifth are over 50. One of the biggest shifts that has happened in recent years, in just the past 2 years, one of the biggest shifts is that most student loans that are going out the door every single year in a given year are either going to graduate students or parents of undergraduates. So increasingly what we're seeing is parents are taking on debt. In some cases, grandparents are taking on debt, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases, and they're going into retirement with this mountain of debt hanging over them. And this really flips the script. It used to be that, parents would pass wealth downward to their children, but right now debt is being passed upward. Wow. Because that's the only way that a lot of families can pay tuition these days. So I think that's a really important point, and it's very hard to get out of this debt. And so I think a lot of these families are going to go to their grave with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt.
Wow. In the first part of your book, you definitely take more of a historical stance of how student loans kind of came to be. Can you talk a little bit about some of the pivotal moments in American history that kind of led up to the creation of student loans? Sure.
So the origins of the student loan program actually goes back to the space race and our relationship with Russia. So 1957 comes around, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first man-made satellite into space. This really shocked Congress and shocked the United States. We were intending to be the first to send a satellite to space, and instead the Soviet Union beat us to it. And it really led policymakers and lawmakers to question whether we had fallen behind in education, because obviously you need scientists and engineers to build technology to win the space race. And so less than a year after Sputnik launches, the government gets into the business of student lending. The ostensible reason was to help us reclaim the space race, get more scientists and engineers out in society, so that we could overtake the Soviet Union and maintain our standing as the global superpower. The 1960s is when it really expanded, when higher education really expanded to this much more broader societal role of leveling inequality. This became part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. This idea that higher education can, really be the magic elixir that, helps level the playing field for poor people and the most disadvantaged people. And this was also in the thick of the civil rights movement. So obviously the 60s was a pivotal moment when the student loan program dramatically expanded it, and it essentially became an entitlement, meaning, if you met basic eligibility criteria, you were entitled to a student loan. Now, one of the biggest pivotal moments, I argue, is in 1965 and then particularly in 1972. Both of those years led to a dramatic expansion of student lending, but they brought into the equation banks. And there's an arcane budgetary reason for this that I'm going to try and condense in a very short amount of time, because I don't want people's eyes to glaze over, but it's important to understand this. The way the government did accounting back then was a strictly cash flow basis, meaning that any cash that came out of the Treasury Department was considered an expense, which meant that if the Treasury Department extended $1 billion in student loans to students in a given year, the federal deficit or spending would go up by that same amount. And so it looked, having a student loan program looked very expensive from a budgetary perspective. And so Lyndon Johnson basically said, I have an idea. If the banks make loans and if we can convince them somehow to make loans to students, it won't show up on the Treasury Department's expenses. It'll, from a taxpayer perspective, look very cheap. Now, this is very ironic because relying on banks, it actually ended up being very expensive. And I know I'm not going to shock a lot of people here when I say this, but banks don't necessarily do things out of the goodness of their heart. It's kind of in their DNA to make money. That's kind of why they are around. Nothing wrong with making money, but that's why they're around. And so they basically said, if you want us to make loans to students, that's fine, but you're going to have to pay us. And so the government ended up paying banks a lot of money over the years, billions and billions and billions and millions of dollars. And it's also the main reason why they created Sallie Mae, to make sure that the banks continue to make a profit in this student loan program. And so in the name of keeping a restraint on government spending, the government actually drove up spending. And I also argue that this is really when college started to become a commodity in the 70s and particularly in the 80s. There were a lot of factors behind this, but one of them was because you had the student loan program became this huge profit center. And by the way, so Sallie Mae was a government-sponsored enterprise, and we can get more into detail about this if you want. Basically, Sallie Mae was like the financial backbone of the higher education system. It was created by Congress, and it was a for-profit corporation that was overseen by Congress, but it basically took taxpayer money and gave that money to banks, which then gave that money to students to pay schools. Now, who owns Sallie Mae? Schools and banks. So this is when student lending and higher education became a commodity, became like a huge profit center. It became an industry through the student loan program, and a lot of people made money off of it.
Yeah, there was a funny comment, a comment that made me kind of chuckle. In your book, you said, lawmakers scrutinized Sallie Mae but didn't know how it worked. If most members of Congress were asked what they thought of Sallie Mae, they would respond with the question, "Who is she?" Senator Jennings Randolph said during a 1981 hearing. So it kind of sounds like they didn't even really know.
Sallie Mae was like was like Frankenstein. And this is like eye-opening when you study how Congress works, and you talk to the people who made the decisions. Like, you realize they don't have this like huge blueprint that makes a whole lot of sense. It's kind of like they're doing this haphazard year by year creation of this, what turned out to be this monster of an industry. And by the way, like, when I got this book deal, it was supposed to take a year, and it took me 3.5 years. And that's because that's how hard it was to really understand how all of these different components work. It wasn't just Sallie Mae. Each state had a nonprofit, quote unquote, student loan agency. And you're probably thinking, like, what the heck is a student loan agency? Well, a student loan agency did a lot of things. Each state had an agency that basically sometimes made loans to students, sometimes guaranteed loans, and then would sell those loans to Sallie Mae. There were so many components involved that no one really understood. Not many people understood how they all worked in tandem. But and it took me a long time to really understand it. And even when I was interviewing CEOs of Sallie Mae, former CEOs of Sallie Mae, like, I ended up knowing in some cases more about their own company than they did, because they were just focused on, like, what was Sallie Mae's job. They didn't always sort of understand how some of these other components worked. And so, yeah, no one knew how this worked. And one of Sallie Mae's its biggest ally in Congress, this Democrat named Bill Ford, from Michigan. He was this blue collar Democrat in the 80s, and he was the head of the education committee at the time. And so he was Sallie Mae's biggest ally, and he was the guy that made things happen. And he said in a hearing, this is clearly a mess. This whole program's clearly a mess. I'm paraphrasing him. But the reason why we protected Sallie Mae is because they keep the trains running on time. That's all we care about. And that I think speaks a lot to how Congress thinks. It's like, oh, we don't want the budget to rise. Let's just have the banks do it, even though that's going to make the budget rise in the long run. Who cares? It's interesting to see how Congress works.
In your book, you talk a lot about for-profit schools versus nonprofit schools. And this was kind of an eye-opening experience for me, because even though I had graduated high school a couple decades ago, I don't remember feeling informed on all the different options that are out there. And kind of in your book, you talk a lot about how the for-profit are actually the schools that are causing the highest amount of student debt for students. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, like, some of the for-profit and nonprofit schools?
Yeah, so if you're comparing apples to apples, yes, for-profit schools, like if you're comparing a for-profit school to a four-year public school, for-profits are going to be more expensive. But a lot of for-profits are also certificate programs. And so, which are like these 6-month programs or 1-year programs rather than four-year bachelor degrees. So yeah, apples to apples, they are more expensive, but if you do a certificate program, you might not be spending as much as you would if you went to a 4-year public school. So it's kind of weird in that way. But for-profit, first of all, for-profit schools have been around since the first GI Bill. And this is really important to understand. As soon as the government started putting money out there for people to go to college with, like people who had a profit motive in mind, like automatically just like instantly stepped up and said, oh, I can figure out a way to make money. And that's not to say all for-profit schools are bad. I don't take that stance. Some people do. I don't. But it is interesting to see that every time the government has expanded its role in this market, for-profit companies step up to the plate and figure out a way to make a lot of money off of it. Now, in the 80s, what I found very fascinating is that for-profit schools had a lot of very ardent protectors in Congress, and these were Democrats at the time. These were Ted Kennedy. These were Bill Ford. These Democrats who were like very pro-union, very blue-collar Democrats, and for-profit schools were seen as a way to help blue-collar workers who were losing their jobs to overseas jobs, to this whole globalization of the economy. As the manufacturing sector declined in employment, you had a lot of out-of-work blue-collar workers, and for-profit schools were seen as the way to retrain them, to get them new skills so that they could survive in this new economy. And so their biggest protectors were Democrats, and Republicans were the ones who were like, including Bill Bennett, who was Ronald Reagan's education secretary in the 80s, was like, no, these for-profit schools are screwing people over. They're not teaching people good skills. They're deceiving students, and they are costing taxpayers a lot of money. We need to crack down on them. So now the politics of for-profit schools have, really flipped. At least as of 10 years ago, when there was this new for-profit school boom, the biggest protectors were Republicans, and the biggest critics were Democrats. And so it's interesting to see how the politics have changed. I think part of that is because, as soon as like Wall Street corporations got involved and really started to invest in these for-profit schools and turn them into these like big, huge national chains, they really, spent a lot of money donating political contributions to Republican lawmakers, and that's who became their biggest protectors.
And I'm sure a lot of the for-profit schools are getting new enrollment right now with the pandemic, more people going to virtual platforms.
Sure. And one of the things I argue in my book, and this is why I hope people come away with a sort of a complicated outlook on higher education after reading my book, because part of the reason why for-profit schools have had such success in expanding is because the public sector hasn't always reached out and taken in disadvantaged people, students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And one of the things I show is public schools and nonprofit private schools have increasingly over the years engaged in this game of prestige, where they don't open their doors to anyone who needs an education. They want to rise in the U.S. News rankings. They want to get more money. I mean, if you read my book, you'll see that I pretty much argue that nonprofit and public schools in a lot of ways act like for-profit schools. And they have engaged in this game of prestige where they want to be very selective. And I'm talking about a certain segment of public and nonprofit schools, not all of them. But so they try to be very selective and not allow in and have a very low admissions rate, which means you have a lot of students who are not being served and have to go elsewhere. I found in one of the earnings calls of one of these big for-profit chains, the CEO said in the early 2000s, he said, business is going great. And one of the reasons why is because this California public school system is telling us to come in and take all these students that they're rejecting. Let's take in these excess students. And so one of the reasons why I think for-profit schools have expanded so much is because there's not a lot of slack in the public school system. It didn't grow fast enough to serve all these students that wanted to be served.
I mean, like I said, I haven't been in high school for a couple decades, but curious if we have any in the audience watching tonight, but I wonder how informed students today are going into, as prospective college students. Are students today aware of the different opportunities that are out there? Do they know the difference between the types of loans they're getting and what the potential debt that they may be holding when they walk out of school with the degree? I guess I'm curious to know, what are we sending our kids off to school with? What knowledge do they have of what they could be possibly carrying the burden of for many years to come? I mean, it could be putting off getting a career, having a family, getting married, buying a house, when you're walking away from a college degree with $50,000 in debt.
Right. I think that is one of the biggest features of the system that explains why student debt has risen so quickly. There has been a huge imbalance of information. Schools have a ton of information. Increasingly, schools have been hiring consultants that take data, student data, hundreds of details of every student down to the latitude and longitude coordinates of their house, down to the income of their parents, the education level of their parents, gender, race, all of these details about each student. They plug them into an algorithm. And then they tell these schools down to the penny how much that particular student is able and willing to pay in tuition. And so schools are able to boil down. It's a lot like how the airlines work when you go on kayak.com and you want to buy an airfare, to go to LA next weekend. You may plug in you may look at 5 p.m. today and it's one airfare, and then you go on tomorrow and it's changed. Well, why is that? Because there's an algorithm to say, how much are you willing to pay? They're trying to gauge, what the market is for airfare. It's the same thing with college. They have so much information. How many times you visit their website, how many times you show up on campus, that tells them all of those details. how eager you want to go there and how willing you are to pay. And so the college has all of the information in the world to know what to charge you. Students and parents don't. There was this phrase that came into existence in the 80s, at least to how it pertained to college. Apparently it's a broader economic theory, but this came to be associated with college tuition. It's called the Chivas-Regal effect. And I identify this in my book. And it basically, Chivas-Regal refers to a high in whiskey. And the theory is that if consumers are uninformed about a product, they will often assume that the most expensive version of that product or most expensive brand of that product is the best brand. So like if you go into a liquor store and you're wanting to buy whiskey, but you have no idea what whiskey is good, and you see two brands on the shelf, you're going to automatically assume that the most expensive one is the higher quality one. It might not be the case, but that's your assumption. And this is what happened with college in the 1980s and even through now. You had college presidents that started to apply this theory to how they set tuition. And they basically said, oh, we need more money. We want more money. We want to raise more money through tuition dollars. Let's raise our prices. Now, normal economic theory would say once you raise prices relative to demand, you're gonna lead to fewer people willing to pay them. But this actually had the opposite effect. People started to assume that the more expensive colleges were the highest quality colleges, and applications actually went up. And again, this is all based on, sort of this lack of consumer knowledge that you're referring to. It was only a few years ago that the government put up this website called the College Scorecard that started telling, students how much each, college, how much debt you could expect to get into if you went to this college. And only more recently was it on the program level. Like if you studied this major or this field of study at this college, this is what you can expect to earn afterward. And this is how much debt you can expect to get into. Up until then, and still in a lot of cases, families have had to take it as an article of faith that this is good debt, and that's what they've been told repeatedly. So this is a really dysfunctional market in terms of like the information that's available to the service provider and the customer.
Yeah, it's funny. I took a quick peek at Sally Mae's website before we got on here. And, they had all the perks of the low interest loans and stuff, but I also noticed lots of little footnotes, the little number with the footnote down below that talked about all the little things that it kind of makes me wonder, they get a lot of probably younger students are enticed by what they're promising and maybe don't know quite what they're actually getting for what they're hoping to get out of their education.
Well, and I, you mentioned you're 2 decades out of high school. I am a little more than 2 decades out of high school, but it was the same thing. I'm sure you heard the message that I did, which was, college is a necessity. It's not a choice.
Yep.
You have to go to college if you want to succeed. And so, and then, the one statistic that's been thrown out there consistently is, if you go to college, you're going to on average earn $1 million more over your lifetime than if you did not, or $2 million more. So there's this huge premium. So if you put it in those terms, then what's $10,000? What's $20,000? So you're going to earn $1 million more. Students often don't know, interest, how that's charged. The government actually charges interest in ways that's different from how the private sector would charge it. And so it's really easy, you can press a computer key and all of a sudden you're tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in some cases. With no one really considering whether you're going to be able to pay that back.
From what I was reading, it looks like, so 2010 was the highest enrollment rate for college.
2009, 2010, yeah. Yep.
And then in the past 10 years or so, it has declined about 1.5% each year. What do you think is, do you think it's the student debt that is affecting that decline?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The biggest part is just the economy. College enrollment is counter-cyclical, meaning particularly what happened in the last recession, the 2008 housing bust. Unemployment surged to 10%, which at the time was a post World War II high, or at least it tied the early 80s as a post World War II high. And so people couldn't find jobs. They were suddenly out of work. And President Obama comes in, his first speech to Congress, he says, I have this national goal of leading the world in college attainment. So now's a good time to go to college. The administration sent a letter to everyone on unemployment saying, go to college if you can, go to your community college, go to a four-year college. Now's a great time to go to college. There's not a lot of jobs available. And so the lack of available jobs, the horrible state of the economy, this push by the Obama administration, this idea that had been built up for 3 decades, that college was a great investment. And by the way, the college wage premium that I mentioned is still very high. So on average, college graduates do make a lot more than only people with a high school diploma. All of these factors led to this historic boom in college enrollment, plus the availability of student loans. Now, as the economy recovers in the early 2010s, and as jobs become more available, you have more people saying, wait a minute, why am I going to go to law school? I can get this really good job here. I don't necessarily need to go to law school. I don't need to go back to a community college or a for-profit school to learn new skills. Employers actually, as the labor market tightened, started to lower the requirements for people having college degrees. So a lot of this is tied to just the state of the economy. But as you mentioned, this public opinion poll that you mentioned shows a lot of people have lost faith in whether it's worth it to go to college. And again, so many people have taken on student debt, and there's a lot of people who have defaulted on the student debt that most of us either know someone with student debt. A lot of people know someone where it ended up horribly for them. They're in default. And I think people have become really concerned about the idea of going to college. So I think it's all those factors.
Yeah. Kind of talking about what you had just mentioned. So there is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And I'm sure it has very rigid guidelines that you have to stick to. But the program forgives the remaining balance on direct loans after we make 120 qualifying monthly payments working for a qualifying public service employer. But I think what was most interesting to me was that it talks about that there are about 3 million student loan borrowers that are eligible to apply for the PSLF, but only about 200,000 have applied. Like, why do you think people aren't taking advantage of a program such as that?
Well, a lot of people have applied, and they just haven't made the 120 qualifying payments yet. So part of it is that this is a relatively new program. It was created in 2007. And so the first, I don't quote me on that. It was like 2007 or 2008. It was late in the Bush years. And so therefore, like the very first borrowers, if you enrolled right away, would not get forgiveness until 2017, 2018. And so it really took a while for people to even understand that there was a program out there. And you have to, the way it's designed, it's really weird. Like you have to enroll and then your payments count. So like you can't retroactively count any money that you've already paid. And that's one thing that a lot of activists say, like, is just a really big, as they see it, flaw in the system. It's like, okay, if you've been paying down debt for 10 years, like, why can't that be counted toward, the amount you need to pay to get forgiveness? Some of it is a lack of awareness. And the other thing is, I have friends like this myself in DC. There are people that, 1 year or, they maybe for 2 or 3 years, they're working for a government agency or a nonprofit agency. And so therefore they could qualify, but they don't necessarily want to stay in that job for 10 years. And you don't have to stay in the exact same job, but you have to make payments while at a nonprofit or a government agency. And so if you do that, if you make those payments, those qualifying payments, oftentimes the payments are too small to cover the interest. And so your balance rises. And so you're forced into this really, really tough decision of, do I lock myself into 10 years at a nonprofit agency, or do I have more flexibility and if you want that flexibility, you don't want to make the qualifying payments, because then your balance is going to rise. And so, like, after 4 years of being at a nonprofit agency, if you decide to go into the private sector, your balance may have risen by $50,000. So these programs are designed in a way that really forces all these weird calculations.
Well, I guess we can take some audience questions. Any final thoughts on, like, if you're any advice to prospective college students, like what do they need to do?
I get
They're
that
really
question all the time.
serious about looking at college. What do we need to inform ourselves about?
I get that question all the time. I share my own personal anecdote, because I try to avoid playing financial advisor. But I do like to make people sort of more aware. I want to inform. And so my personal story is that I, as a journalism student in DC, growing up just outside of DC in Maryland, I felt like I had to get into Northwestern University, which was like the best journalism program in the country at the time. And, I saw that everyone at the Washington Post and the big newspapers, had gone to Northwestern. And I felt like if I wanted to make it in the journalism industry, I had to go there. And if I didn't get in, I would be doomed and I would have to choose another field of study. I got rejected by Northwestern. I just didn't have the grades. So I went to Maryland, my state flagship university, and things turned out fine. I covered the Final Four basketball team at the student newspaper, and I learned a lot just through that. I considered it more of sort of like an apprenticeship. Spending so much time at the student newspaper versus a lot of time in the classroom. But things turned out fine, and I got a lot of experience, and I ended up at a really great newspaper and writing this book. And so don't get caught up in this idea that you have to go to this college at any price. Don't get caught up in the prestige game. Schools like you to get caught up in that. They rely on that. They hire these consultants to convince you that, like, they are the one. So just be aware, be informed.
Great, thank you. All right, so we have a couple of questions here. Okay, so Danielle asks, what do you feel is the solution for student debt? Educating prospective students, starting with loan companies, and also how do you feel about possible debt relief forgiveness from the government? I had a feeling we'd get a question about that tonight.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I discovered when I was reading up on the history of this program is that before the government got involved, before Sputnik, there were a number of schools that would actually make loans to their students. They would use their own money, or in some cases they would pair up with private banks to make loans to students. But what was interesting was if the schools, so the default rates on these loans were very low in a lot of cases. And one of the reasons why, I suspect, is because the schools were on the hook if the student defaulted. In other words, if the school had this like built-in incentive to not award all of this debt on the students that students wouldn't be able to repay, because if students didn't repay it, the school would end up having to eat a lot of those losses, if not all of them. And so so history can be a guide here. If schools have skin in the game, history shows they're more reluctant to award reckless loans to students. Lawmakers of both parties, I think, that I've talked to seem to agree with this broad concept. Now, Democrats, again, try to focus on for-profit colleges and say, look, we need to require for-profit colleges to repay taxpayers all this loan money if all of their students default on it. Republicans seem to, want to focus more on the prestigious, nonprofit schools, but they all seem to agree that one of the things that has to happen if you want to rein in prices is you have to have schools have a lot more skin in the game than they do right now. Now, the question about student debt relief and forgiveness, let me address President Biden's proposal to forgive $10,000 across the board. In one sense, it's not really arbitrary that he chose that amount. Most defaults on student loans, somewhat counterintuitively, are people who owe less than $10,000. And one of the main reasons why is because a lot of people who are defaulting on their loans went to their local community college or went to a certificate program at a for-profit school or a four-year program at a for-profit school, and they just dropped out. Or maybe they completed it, but it wasn't that great of a school, or they couldn't find a job afterward. And so you have a lot of people who are just walking around with $8,000 in debt, and they're just not going to repay it. And this is what you could call toxic debt. It's just debt that's sitting on the government's books. It's growing. The balances are growing because people aren't paying it back, and the interest is accruing. And if these were private banks who the debt was sitting on their books, they would just write it off. And in fact, that's what happened with Sallie Mae back in 2008. They actually needed a bailout at the time. The Bush administration bailed them out, as did Congress. And they basically said, we're writing off some of this debt. And they sold some of it to the government, but they basically said, we're no longer going to make any loans to these bad schools because we're losing a lot of money now. So forgiving $10,000 would probably wipe out a lot of the loans that people are defaulting on. It wouldn't do anything for the underlying issues that I lay out in my book, because you're sort of helping people currently with student debt, but you're not. But like, what about the next cohort of students this fall that are going to take out a lot of debt? You still have this cyclical problem. So there needs to be more if you really want to address some of the problems that I lay out in my book.
Kirk asks, what's the typical lengths on student loans and how many years? Yes,
that's a great question. It used to be 10 years. That you would it used to be a standard 10-year loan. In the 1990s, I got this from a report that Betsy DeVos had hired people to do in her final year in office as the education secretary. In the 1990s, on average, someone who took out a student loan would pay back 100% of the balance plus a few percentage points. So it's something like 100 to 103% within 10 years, meaning they would pay back the principal plus a lot of the interest. And that was standard. Now, as since 2016, I want to say, don't quote me on this, but something like in the past 10 years, the average repayment rate is not 102% after 10 years. It's something like 78%. So now what's happened is, and this is in part because of the Obama administration, more and more people are spreading their loan payments out over 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years. And that's because the loan amounts in a lot of cases have become so high that if you were to make payments on a 10-year plan, it would just be impossible to make the monthly payment. I mean, the main character in my book is this woman who graduated. She earned her PhD in 2001. She had to get a PhD because she wanted to be a psychologist, and the state that she resided in required people who owned a psychology practice to have a PhD. So she owed something like $120,000. Now, without interest, paying that over 10 years would be $1,000 a month. And she was just starting out. She had 2 young children. It was just impossible. At an interest well over $1,000. So what did they do? They said, okay, go into a 30-year loan. And that's increasingly what's happening. People are, these loans that used to be 10 years are now turning into basically mortgages.
Wow. Okay. Are there distinctions on the amount of loans by a type of degree?
Right. I think what Kirk is asking is, does the government give you different loan amounts based on what you're studying? The answer is no. And that is one of the interesting features of this program, is if you're studying to be an engineer, you can borrow the same amount that you would as if you're studying, English, or if you're studying history, or, there's a lot of variation in what students earn based on their field of study, but there's no variation on what they borrow. The variation is just on, what school they go to. So, that's one of the things when people talk about how to reform this program, that is one idea out there, is, let's set the loan amounts based on the earning potential on your field of study, but currently that does not happen. Now, graduate school, you can borrow more than undergraduate, but still, like if you're studying, to be a master's in X versus a master's in Y, it's the same loan amount.
See, I think do we have some questions on Facebook?
Yeah, it says, I see Robin has,
I want students to know when it comes to graduate school after college, PhD students in STEM fields generally pay zero tuition and do not need to take any loans. PhD students can also earn a stipend by working part-time as a teaching assistant or research assistant, enough to cover their living expenses. So if you get a bachelor's degree in a STEM field, you can go to grad school for free.
Yeah, in some cases, yeah. I see Ryan asked, like, are people now sacrificing their own retirement to pay for their children's college? Yes. The main character in my book, she, was paying $700 to $800 a month, every month for 17 years, to pay off her loans. And, she was saving barely anything for retirement. And even then, even after she paid her original balance and then some, she still owed $100,000 because of the interest that had accrued. So, that's why, I have a lot of people who ask me, like, when is the crash going to happen? Like, when is this whole market going to crash? And I say, well, it's already kind of happened. If you want to look at, sort of the effects of student debt, the effects are already out there. A lot of people are not saving for retirement. There are studies that show student debt is preventing some people from creating a business or buying a home. And these are things that we don't really notice. We sort of it's like a more subtle effect on the economy, but it's still a big effect. And I argue it's more of like the frog boiling in the pot, but not knowing it's boiling. So the answer is yes, that is happening, I think.
All right. I think that is all our questions from our audience. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. And Josh, thank you so much for your time. And
sure, thank you.
Again, I'll just mention his book just came out, The Debt Trap, How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe, just came out August 3rd, and you can purchase it from the Learned Owl Bookshop, and we have the link in the chat if you're interested in purchasing. So thank you all tonight for joining us, and Josh, thank you again for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, and great question.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.